The thesis of how do we get developers to adopt tools is to make it super easy. There's this virtuous cycle around trying to sort of establish something as a best practice, and it has to start from simplified.
Forced behaviors and sensible defaults can go a really long way to correcting and influencing the behavior you want from people, especially for security.
Our head of product is not a developer, and she forces us to think in the context of a user.
Design really has to be a team sport in DevTools companies.
It's really hard to sell risk reduction without hyping the risk. Finding security issues is pointless. What's useful is fixing security issues.
Hi, I'm Steve.
And I'm David, and you're listening to Don't Make Me Code, a bi-weekly series where we discuss developer experience and some of the unique challenges we face building developer-facing products.
Don't Make Me Code is brought to you by HeavyBit, a 9-month program for developer-facing startups. For more information, visit heavybit.com.
And if you're interested in being a guest on this show, or if you have a specific topic you'd like us to dive into, you can reach us at dmmc@heavybit.com or on Twitter @Don'tMakeMeCode.
We're calling this episode of Don't Make Me Code Security Ergonomics, and we're here with Guy Podjarny, the CEO of Snyk.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And so we always start with a little intro. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and about Snyk?
Sure, yeah. So my background, I'm Israeli. I worked in security for about a decade, or actually maybe about 14 years if you sort of count the Israeli army, and moved to Canada somewhere in that process. Went through a bunch of acquisitions. Left security to found a web performance startup called Blaze, which got acquired by Akamai. I was a CTO at Akamai for 3.5 years or so, moved to London in the process. So that's where I am now. And about a year and a half ago or so, got the itch to get back into startup land. Left Akamai to found Snyk. At Snyk is a developer tooling company that does security. That's really the core premise of the company. Right now, we focus on open source security, specifically in the Node.js world, helping you find and fix vulnerabilities in Node.js NPM dependencies, and just sort of make that as easy and seamless as possible, as I'm sure we'll talk about during the episode.
The title Security Ergonomics comes from an interesting place. We all, as makers of developer tools, have concerns of both security and, of course, developer experience design. And in your world, those things collide. And so I'm interested to hear more about how the product and its security and UX play together.
Right, yeah. So we think that ergonomics, the ease of use, how do you sort of consume security is key and critical in the adoption of security by developers. Right? There's this balance when you talk about security. Everybody wants to build secure software, but it's hard, right? When you look at the security tooling landscape today, it tends to be in pretty bad shape in terms of usability, right? It tends to be expensive tools that are hard to get started with. They don't tend to be self-serve. And there's a lot of good technology there. They build a lot of sophistication inside, but it's not easy to maybe get it out. When you expect developers to embrace security, there's a lot of factors, a lot of ways or needs to do this. There's a lot of incentive question, but fundamentally, there's a big aspect of how do you get started. First of all, you talk about why should you get started, and why do you care? How do you even get going? And then subsequently, if you do want to do it, what's your first step? At developers, we have a very short attention span in that sense, right? You've got a minimal amount of time to capture somebody and actually try it out. So it was already a bit of a higher bar to get somebody even interested, get a developer that oftentimes perceive it as not their job, to still try it out, still try a tool, and now it needs to sort of just work. So a lot of our premise, in fact, a lot of the sort of the thesis of how do we get developers to adopt tools is to make it super easy, right? If there's this kind of balance of, you can imagine this scale where on one hand you have how much you care about security, and on the other side you have, how much friction it is or how hard is it to address it. So on one hand we try to educate and everybody should care more about security, but on the other side it's just, let's make it dead easy, right? Just make it as trivial as possible to get going. And, then you can act and you can take your first step and, then we have a conversation and I can kind of move you forward.
I think that's a really interesting way to think about it. I mean, it seems like almost every time you're thinking about security, like you're almost like by nature making things harder to use, almost by definition, I guess. Like, for example, like one-time passwords, like great, like now all my accounts are more secure, but I have to go set them up and like have some way to make sure that all my employees have them set up and like deal with management of all of that. And it just like adds all of this extra friction and work. and I know that it's good, so I do it, but it's just like...
Right, yeah, and it ends up working, right? For most things, if it's easier, you do it more. And security is, not only is it not an exception, it's probably even kind of stronger in that sense. I think for many of these things, there's the ease of use and first action, and then there's some perception of what is right or what is minimal, right? There are some things you do lock the door at home, well, maybe not everywhere in the world, but like in most places you would lock the door. And you don't really like sit there and do a calculated risk of whether it's worth your time to sort of, put that key in the lock and twist it or sort of turn it. It's just something you do. So there's some social norms, there's some best practices that people accept. And I feel like in some aspects of security today, like you talk about one-time passwords, those have evolved and they go hand in hand with simplicity. So having a password for every single account would not make sense at all before you had password managers, because you wouldn't remember them, right? You're just human, and you wouldn't really think about, like humans are lousy at thinking about what will be a hard password and what wouldn't be. So now you have auto-generated password, easily stored in sort of a 1Password or LastPass or whatever that you have in them in there. So suddenly it became easier, right? Similarly, phones made two-factor auth easier. So all of these things go hand in hand, where on one hand it becomes easier, so people are more willing to adopt it, and then they see others using it, and it just sort of becomes a bit of a norm. And in the techie world, for instance, today things like a password manager have really become very popular. They haven't quite permeated to the sort of general population. So, but I think there's this virtuous cycle around trying to sort of establish something as a best practice, and it has to start from simplifying.
Yeah, to me, it's almost like tools that introduce new sensory perceptions to us, that password managers give us the added ability to kind of see and share passwords. I think about it like in your cell phone address book, like how we don't have to remember anyone's phone number anymore. They're just there. And we don't have to remember our passwords anymore because we have great password managers. And for vulnerabilities, it feels like you're introducing a new sensory perception. Now I can see where these vulnerabilities live, and I have a tool to fix them. And so now it both raises awareness of the issue and helps me get the power to do something about it.
Yeah, precisely. And this is great in general and kind of a good path to maybe try and model in the world of security. There is still a challenge where some security actions are security features and they're very visible. You might not think about the implications of them, but they're at least in your face, like authentication is a good example of that. But some others are a little bit more insurance and a little bit more backseen. So one of the challenges, one of the goals is to try and bring them up, right? Just make you aware of the problem. A good example of this is HTTPS, or maybe another example. I released this blog post that talked about how HTTPS adoption has doubled in the last year or so, or sort of between July of 2015 and 2016. And, first of all, that's awesome and it's nice and sort of like a little bit of a mini security celebration. We don't get many of those. The other aspect of it is to say, why, right? And how can we replicate that elsewhere? And when you look at it and we try to unravel it, this is theory at this point, right? Because, you don't really know the sort of causation and correlation and all that stuff. But when you compare why that happened, there's been a combination of simplification, carrots and sticks, right? On one hand, it became easier. Things like, Cloudflare made it free and easy and just a checkbox. GitHub Pages have it on by default. Let's Encrypt made it both cheaper and more automation friendly to be able to get a certificate. So it's just been easier. Another aspect is sticks, like Google telling you that HTTPS would rank you higher, or would rank you lower if your site was not HTTPS, or browsers saying they're going to show an indicator on HTTP sites to say that you are not secure if you are not HTTPS, as opposed to showing you sort of a green indicator when you are secure. So that's sort of a big stick. And then you've got all sorts of carrots like HTTP2 and Service Worker and a bunch of new web technologies that are only enabled on HTTPS. So it's sort of this combo of things that incentivize behavior and incentivize like both as individuals and organizations. And once again, HTTPS is like very visible. So now you browse websites and you can visibly see that there are just more HTTPS or whether it's HTTPS. Vulnerabilities are tricky. They're sort of backseen. And a lot of our challenge is to try and, make you aware of it. It's sort of this find stage, the ability of finding those issues. So we need to make it easier for you to find the issues. Now that you have them, then you have the opportunity to take action.
Yeah, and so that's an interesting point, that something like a browser plugin, or how Chrome will tell you if a website is not secure, and it's in your face and it's in a place where an end user can see it. But like you were saying, vulnerabilities are behind the scenes. They're a little bit harder to discover. And so what does that look like for a Snyk user? How do you expose that to them, and how do you kind of give them that ability to see things more clearly?
It's a constant challenge, first of all, I will say that. And when you talk about security, there's the initial take action, understand your current status, and then there's the ongoing what happens when the new vulnerability gets disclosed. So first we need to get you to use the product. So it was just about lowering the bar to understand all of those dependencies and vulnerabilities that you have very, very quickly and easily. We actually had a good learning about this moving from, or sort of expanding from our command line interface, from our CLI to a GitHub integration. So what we've observed is we had a really, what I think is a really easy to use command line interface where you could just do install Snyk, npm install Snyk, install-g, and then you go to a folder and you do Snyk test. And it finds all the issues. It has good links and handy information around what is the title of each vulnerability and how was it found, and some severity indicator to align priority. And people liked it and they used it on one project or on two projects, because it then became a bit of a hassle to go through and you had to have it cloned. So that was one of our learnings from the CLI. When we did the GitHub integration, when we added that, then we modified that page and we had all the GitHub repositories, and you had a test button next to each one of those that you can do. And you would hit test and you would see the issues. And lo and behold, users would press the test button on one or two or three of the repositories. They wouldn't do them all the way. So we modified it and we made it auto-run the test, right? We had to do some tech kind of backend to be able to withstand that. But basically, as soon as you open that page up, it runs a test, which is totally static and non-obtrusive, on all of your repositories. Suddenly, users browse through all of those, and they now are substantially more, like we see this in the numbers, right? Substantially more inclined to take action on the issues because they have a bunch of these repositories that may or may not have been their top priority, but you make them aware of it. So that was in the onboarding and kind of the initial, just sort of expose them to the range of the problem. Then we have a whole set of other actions that have to do with proactive alerts and sending new issues when there's a new vulnerability that is applicable to you and that is relevant. How do we make you aware of it? And we've done all sorts of things around making, even if there's one champion on the team that has integrated Snyk, many of these notifications would go into, for instance, a fix pull request, right? There's a new vulnerability. We send you a fix pull request with the changes to make it go away. One advantage of that is it's a fix pull request. What better way to find out about a problem than with the solution of it? But the other is, while there was one champion that integrated, everybody sees the pull request. And that sort of exposes it. We have a bunch of other integrations with other pull requests, just allowing the one champion to now propagate that throughout the team.
I really like that model. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, kind of using GitHub as a distribution mechanism almost that really aligns for some of the tools that we've been using too. We just added Hound and CodeCov and a couple of other things to one of our repos, and we did it because you could just push a button and sort of get some really interesting information about your code, without too much effort. Yeah, I mean, all it took is one person deciding to go try those tools, and now it's added to the repo, and eventually the whole team is using it. It's been successful with us, so I think.
And I think that's been a recurring theme here too, is that we all set out to discover ways of introducing our tools into workflows that devs are already doing every day. Because if you, like with your early CLI, if you require them to kind of break their normal everyday flow and do something different, they're just not going to do it. And so the GitHub integration is awesome because they're probably going there every day anyway. But that exact process, I feel like we've had a number of people talk about that exact sort of discovery process, where how can we take our thing, integrate it into a normal everyday workflow that devs are already doing to make that seamless. And that's awesome that you've discovered that so quickly and made it seamless for people.
Yeah, thanks. And I think, we definitely sort of see the benefits of it. It was also good, the champions actually appreciate this. So this is not just sort of you helping, whatever, Snyk propagate more through the organization. It's you're helping this, champion that cares about security. And, once a team reaches a certain size, fortunately there typically is, some people that are in that category. You help them now educate and communicate with the rest. So not only is it sort of useful for us as sort of a business and sort of permeate the tools, it's actually, helpful, and those champions feel like, we support them because we do sort of help them educate the world. The other aspect of integrating with GitHub, not only do you sort of expose more users to it, it's the fact that you, again, lower the bar around ease of use, right? You come to them, they don't need to come to you. And if you introduce another view, which inevitably you will need to because there's a lot of information and there's just, only so much you can do it. But if you have the right hooks, the right sort of pointers to tell them about a problem, or about a necessary action or about a potential action, like something that they could do, then it just gives you the opportunity to provide value with a lower bar and then allow them to grow into deeper use of the tool.
Yeah, at the last company I worked at, we attempted to do something similar with vulnerabilities, and we could detect them pretty well. And our biggest traffic days by far were like when Heartbleed and Shell Shock hit. Those were some of our biggest traffic days, and it was, not great news for our end users, but they served as good marketing tactics. Like we could go write a blog post about how we would automatically find and help people fix vulnerabilities. And another thing we were kind of talking about before was the walking the line between good product marketing and scare tactics, because we don't want to seem like we're scaring people into using our product, but this is also it's valuable information.
Yeah, I think being constructive in security is tricky, right? Like at the end of the day, we're promoting using tools that are kind of insurance, right? You are doing something to reduce risk. And if that risk hasn't materialized, it's really hard to know whether that is useful for you or not, right? You bought this awesome new lock for the door, and then the next day nobody broke in. Does that mean it was smart to buy that lock for the door? Or actually, no, what bothers me a little bit more is that you didn't buy a brand new lock for the door, and then the next day nobody brought in. Is it smart to basically persist that behavior now? And, sometimes, it's only when the person actually gets hacked, right, or gets broken into that sort of triggers a behavior. In other cases, it's other factors, whether a desire to protect themselves or whether somebody else getting hacked, just sort of scares them a little bit into action. It's really hard for us. We set out to make Snyk a helpful brand, which manifested in even like the color scheme on the website, right, just in many, many different aspects of the company. And it's a constant challenge, right? It's really hard to sell risk reduction without hyping the risk. But, we try to sort of be helpful and focus on the fixes. And I think that's maybe where, talking about Heartbleed or Shell Shock and such, if you talk about a vulnerability just in the case of, this guy is falling, how terrible this is, we're all, hosed, then, that's sort of one thing. But if you talk about it in the sense of, hey, there's this really big problem here, and here are some very handy things for you to fix and to help and protect yourself, suddenly it's appreciative and it's constructive. It's a builder's post, not a scarer's post.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. So, thinking about tools, like Snyk or just security in general, where it's like, if you're setting out to build a new application, this isn't sort of like one of the required steps between you and like Hello World on the web, right? How do you get into that sort of like required stack like that people think about on the web?
It's not a simple feat, right? And hopefully it comes back to the almost peer pressure, right? Or they sort of become a best practice. How did test-driven development kind of start to get traction? Arguably nowhere near sufficient still. Or even CI, right? I think today code coverage, continuous integration, these are things that they pay dividends, maybe like not in terribly long periods of time, but they pay dividends. But people don't tend to, I guess my thesis is that people don't do them because, again, they sort of sat down and did some sort of thorough thinking around whether this is worth their while and whether a falsely broken build is, not too time consuming, et cetera, versus what they get. They do it because it's a best practice, because that's how it's done. So we try to help permeate this and make it easy, but also try to help, those thought leaders and, the open source projects and such that use Snyk to advertise it through badges, through, just conversations and highlights. And, we haven't quite figured out like a referral or a sharing mechanism, but, we, coming back to the fact that everybody wants to be secure, we want to help the ones that do, those champions, help them celebrate that success. There's no single recipe, and I'd love always open to ideas and things that we can do because it's a constant challenge.
Yeah. The case for it seems to be making itself in the media that every week there's another vulnerability and another hack, and that this seems like a core competency, like something that every company is going to have to do soon. Like we're going to have to find and fix vulnerabilities quickly because they're exploited as fast as they're found.
Mm-hmm. And I think another aspect of trying to get this done in the world of software as a whole and evolution is about sharing what you do. And that's another thing that security is scary for people. Like, Opsy wrote this great post around the container stack, right? Or sort of how you chose a container orchestration system. And people really care about that, right? Because again, you don't want to make this super extremely knowledgeable request every time. It's okay to rely on some mass smarts and, somebody that you see as a role model who has made a good decision and outlines what they did. People are afraid to share their security practices, right? It feels like, I've just outlined all the things that I do, so you can find the things I don't do, and now you can kind of hack in. And it's hard. The DevOps kind of revolution, sort of evolution that happened, a lot of it was based on these blameless postmortems around, people getting up on stage and talking about, how they do deployments, how they handle the failure, how they had this massive outage and what they did about it. Really, really important for us to try and, as much as we can, evolve some of these practices around security, right? And sort of see another post around, how you handle security, which security controls do you have, and help each other learn.
Yeah, so segueing into we've been talking about how we approach design and security, and so now we're all building teams to do this well. And another recurring topic on the show is how the dev tool space is one where it still feels like design is underserved and we need more of it. And it sounds like you've done a great job building a team to solve this problem with good design from the beginning.
Yeah, so I'd like to think we did, and it was intentional because I think, as I kind of mentioned before, we were keen to make it easy and kind of lower the bar around getting started. So my head of product, Joanna Coleman, who's she's amazing, and she's a UX person, right? Here we are, this developer tooling companies that does security, like heavily technical topic. And our head of product is not a developer. She's the only non-developer on the team, which, she kind of pays for every day. But at the same time, she's an amazing sort of UX person, and she forces us to think all the time, even when we're sort of inclined to sort of jump to our sort of technical conversations, to think in the context of a user and how does that flow. We brought a good designer up front. We actually had an interesting conversation, by the way, it veers a little bit off the team, around color scheme, which was fascinating to me around designers. This is like one of my learning experiences working with UX and designers, where we wanted to build this color brand, or we wanted to build a brand that is all about helpful and help fix issues. And the designer, Mark, when he started working with us, he interviewed a bunch of people, he got that theme, and he came up with a color scheme suggesting it. And it was all, really good in terms of being, welcoming and warm. And it was not at all alarming, including the colors for like the high severity vulnerability that you need to address, which should be a little bit alarming. Mm-hmm. This is the point where fear should kick in just a little bit. And it was really interesting to try and balance that. We get to this like magenta color for the high severity that sort of fit in. But it was a really interesting kind of exercise. So yeah, I'm really happy that we did this. We, thanks to Joanna, and I think the acceptance now of the entire team, but really sort of led by her and kind of the culture we've now built. We really do think about user flows all the time. We think about making it better to fix, right? When you think about security issues, finding security issues is pointless. It's actually not at all useful. What's useful is fixing security issues. So if there is already an easy thing to do to fix the problem, then sometimes all you need to do is help point the problem out and somebody will take action. But in our world, oftentimes there isn't an easy way to fix it. So it was important for us to actually build the functionality that helps fix it. Otherwise, all we're doing is just causing noise for you. So in our team, I think right now we've managed to permeate that a lot. We're very tempted whenever there's some, big hack or something like that to sort of write some post about it. And always somebody else in the team now chimes in and says, hold on, how is this useful to people? How is it just not, some noise? I just got held back by Danny, by my co-founder, sort of trying to talk about the sort of the DNC conversation and, how the sort of the hacking happened there. And once again, well, how is that useful? And sort of stop there.
Yeah, we had a really similar conversation about colors, and it's one of those things in the monitoring world that is codified. And so we had to use red, yellow, green, and we ended up calling it salmon instead of red. So, and in our marketing, you do actually see some red, but we never go straight to, and I can't even give scientific reasons for any of this. It was just don't use red in monitoring marketing. Bad idea.
Yeah, it's there's definitely a lot to learn. I guess it comes down to sort of design and UX being every sort of single detail, right, in that flow.
I'd be curious, how do you get it sounds like you have dedicated designers. Do you get them involved even in things like CLI design? I saw the CLI demo on your website. It's beautiful. How do you sort of integrate design at that level?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of evolution going on there. So, first of all, we watched your talk, David, on on sort of the heavy bit library, which was very, very, very helpful on sort of this notion. I love the sort of the premise of small, sharp tools. So, it started there, just, maybe even with me, right, just sort of talking about, what are the sort of core functionalities? I worked with a very opinionated person on our team, which is Remy Sharp, who's really kind of well known in the JavaScript world and has a lot of experience, has built JSBin and Nodemon. So he came in with some experience. So that one didn't come from the designers per se. It actually came from just sort of a strong, opinionated view from the different people on the team, and having the user perspective just sort of dominate. And we ended up building, we actually designed 3 underlying core actions, or 4 actually: the authentication, which is not always kicked in, the Snyk test to find issues, Snyk protect to apply patches when you need to, and Snyk monitor to take a snapshot of your dependencies so we can alert you to new ones. And then we built an interactive overlay on top of those with Snyk Wizard, which just runs the test, figures out what the next actions should be from the test's output, and just walks you through doing it. So the wizard has its own logic, but you don't have to do it. You can get the full functionality without the hand-holding from the product if you use kind of those 4 underlying actions. So it manifested well there. I think the contribution of UX there, a little bit less the sort of design, pure sort of visual, came a lot into the information architecture, sort of deciding which pieces of information really need to be shown there on the CLI versus which ones we can link off to the website. So that was a very big kind of decision component. And then the other, in our world, there's basically a different user flow between remediation and vulnerabilities. I probably don't want to sort of go too deep into it here, but when you might have multiple instances of the same vulnerable dependency across your tree, in which case you have one vulnerability multiple times. We call it vulnerable paths. Once again, multiple iterations that we've had to sort of get to these names. So you have multiple vulnerable paths. And when you talk about vulnerabilities, you want to consolidate those together. But sometimes you have a single dependency that, because it brings in a tree of dependencies under it, actually introduced 4 different vulnerabilities, different types, different vulnerable components, in which case, it's multiple known vulnerabilities, but it's really just one action, one remediation action that you need to do. So logically, we actually have a remediation workflow and a vulnerabilities workflow. And naturally, you kind of want them to mesh together, but they just don't. And some of that acknowledgement was hard. So right now, I would say our web UI is based on the vulnerability workflow, and our CLI is based on remediation, acknowledging that when you're in the CLI, you're in that mindset. You're in the mindset of, I'm right there, I'm really close to my issues, and really my goal is to make this go away. I'm not in a mode to sort of soak up a lot of information, while on the web, you're much more in a report mode, you're much more in a consumption. And, we have a fix button, which is awesome. And you sort of have a fix button, just makes the problem go away. But the fix button is less hand-holdy and a little bit more just automagical.
That's a really interesting point. We had an almost identical conversation with Sean Lee, the head of product design at Docker, about how they differentiate their tasks between the web UI and the desktop app. And he said something almost the same, which was that for visibility and discovery of what's going on, they rely on the web UI. And so there's a great tool for visualization, but people still go back to the command line to get things done. That's how they feel comfortable and fast. And that seems to be also a common thread among DevTools companies. Like we by nature go back to the command line to get things done, but nice visual interfaces can be great for discovery.
Yeah, and I think for me it was a learning experience, because my natural inclination coming in was that we would basically want to create 2 different interfaces to the same functionality, right? You can fix via the CLI if you're kind of more terminal biased, or you can fix via the web if that's kind of your preference. And I thought that we will do it that way. Unfortunately, we didn't actually set that as a requirement as much. I don't know if that's by chance or a design. And because of that, we just sort of designed the workflows for each of those and learned about it after the fact. And then I kind of beat myself up about it a little bit, because I built a product called AppScan earlier in my career, which is a security web application security scanner. This is at the time we had to educate people what cross-site scripting and SQL injection was. And back then, lo and behold, we would find issues. They would have multiple variants, we had a vulnerabilities view and a remediation view. It sort of ended up getting to the same spot, which made perfect sense to me after we got to the same conclusion at Snyk. But somehow it kind of escaped my mind ahead of time. So maybe it cost us a little bit of time.
The team composition point is also really interesting, because one of the things I worry about the most as a designer of DevTools is that there are certain kinds of solutions that I just won't come up with as naturally as a developer, like going to a CLI solution. Like I'm just not going to think of that right away. And that design really has to be a team sport in DevTools companies, where developers and designers are working together towards solutions. And it seems like more and more product companies are moving this way to have designers and developers embedded on product teams, but it just seems like table stakes for a DevTools company. Like you can't have designers working in isolation because they just won't come up with the best solution in every case.
Yeah, and I think for us, it also necessitated some process. So we have our dev team, our entire team is split between London and Israel. That was a decision because, we just sort of have awesome people from different backgrounds in those two locations. And, it was a good decision, but it costs us, right? We're a small company and there's a cost, there's a cultural cost. We try to fly people around and all that. We've got video calls, but still. And one of the things that forced us to do, and also maybe something that came from the London mindset and maybe from Joanna even and myself, is to still instill a certain amount of process and documentation, right? And make sure that things are outlined and are defined. And I think that gives us an opportunity to talk about UX a little bit more. And we can see like the cases where we fall, the cases where we get it wrong, are typically cases where we hacked something together, or that we sort of built it a little bit more in one of the locations versus the other, and we just built it, we just got it done, which is great in many, many aspects, but it also implies there wasn't really as much of an opportunity to just have the conversation. Just the sheer need to explain from like one party to another, what is it that you are doing and why you're doing it is very valuable. So although I think today I feel like design and UX, we've sort of succeeded. That's one thing I feel is successful, right? It permeated through the company. But sometimes when you get excited, you still want to just get something done and you just want to have functionality out. So that process gives you an opening for it. Process is generally a bad word in my mind, but it is helpful sometimes.
There was a really interesting talk here at Heavy Bit by a product manager talking about his presence at companies, at early stage companies, and how his greatest influence on the company is just by sitting in his chair. He doesn't have to do anything or ask anyone to do anything. His presence just makes them aware that they need to like document the order of operations and how they're going to do things. And I feel like design can be similar, that it forces everyone to think about how we're going to do something before it gets done, if only for the benefit of the designer who has to work on that. And so, like getting that as part of your process is really valuable, I think, especially to early stage teams who can be really chaotic if they're not careful.
Yeah, I got to say that So this happens not just dev tooling companies and not even just the small companies. When I was a CTO at Akamai, we would sit at some of these exec teams and talk about components. And it's funny because there I was always the anti-process person, and it sort of became a little bit that sentiment when somebody said that we need to set a process for this, they would kind of look at me and semi-apologize for it, because I was always like a little bit more. And I got to say that like over the course of those conversations and now maybe kind of implementing some of those learnings, I've kind of learned to appreciate process where process is due. But yeah, sometimes it's just sort of the influence of an individual that represents a concept or represents an ideal or an importance is useful to just get you to the right decision.
Let's talk about the ergonomics of security. This one really hits home for me because we had an issue at Opsy onboarding people into the product where we had, I think, the easiest way of doing things, which was just asking for some Amazon API keys to get started with the product. But people bounced. They didn't like it. They called us out on it not being secure. And so when we changed it, it was more difficult, but it improved our onboarding. Like more people were willing to take part. And so that was a really weird case for us where something that was harder for the user ended up being the better choice. And so this, you told us about this term, security ergonomics. So I'm interested to hear more about your view on it.
Yeah, I think usability and security are often enemies, and sometimes you need to build something to make it simple. And we mentioned some of these two-factor auth and other examples, and I think that extensions or this concept extends all the way from tooling such as token management or things like that. They're sort of heavy dev tools, all the way out to like a user browsing a website. I gave this talk with Rachel Illen-Simpson, a designer in Munich for the Chrome team, who's amazing. And we talked a lot about HTTPS and in general around Chrome and how they handle security. And we ended up sort of doing this talk called Security Ergonomics, talking about why do users make insecure decisions? And I feel like some of those lessons actually expand out to pretty much like the breadth of those. We ended up narrowing it down to three things, right? One is different motivations. So when a user comes in and wants to sort of take action, they are looking to take action, right? They're browsing to Facebook. They want to see baby pictures. Anything you sort of put in the way, it's just in their way. They're just going to push through, right? They want to see their bank account. So you have to remember that users have different motivations, and you have to sort of make sure that you help them get to that motivation. Sometimes security is motivation. Probably you've seen that in OPSI. So they need to sort of feel secure as they're doing it, but you have to sort of figure out what are the motivations of the user taking the action. The second is lack of expertise. You can see a lot of that, right? If you clicked one of those yellow things on the Chrome browser around the lock, you will see that this is yellow because the SHA-1 algorithm was sort of deprecated, and it's like, you can count on one hand, right, the number of people that understand that statement and that would know what to do to act on it, right? I'm a security expert. I'm not entirely sure what I'm supposed to do when I see that message. So you have to sort of understand that users don't have security expertise and try to help them make the right decision, even if you give them the alternate decision, try to sort of guide them. Great examples in browsers around disabling and making it hard, all but impossible, to get through the security exception, the sort of bad certificate prompt. And browsers have really evolved how they handle that. And while it's still technically doable, they've managed to get drastic reductions in click-throughs. And then the last bit was this notion of forgiveness as a continuum, and talk about how when somebody does make an insecure decision, try to kind of walk them through it. Can they start with something that's a little bit less secure and you can evolve them through it, right? Is this something that can be temporary? In Snyk, we do something around allowing you to ignore vulnerability, but by default, it ignores it for 30 days. So we had to let you ignore vulnerability because sometimes you just have nothing to do about it. And if we wanted you to sort of break the build or do something that's like a gatekeeper around those vulnerabilities, we had to let you get through. So, but at the same time, we don't want to make it too easy to ignore a vulnerability. So we built in this option that forces you to just give a reason, just text, nothing special. And it's just for audit purposes, for your own audit purposes. But you can ignore it. And by default, we would ignore it for 30 days. And you can go into that file and you can edit it and you can make that expiry be far out. But hardly anybody does. And in 30 days, it'll bug you. And hopefully by then, there would be other remediation solutions. Or maybe the third time it bugged you, you would actually take action and actually swap that dependency for something else. So I think the notion of like forgiveness as a continuum and how do you kind of walk the user through a path of security and that it's not all black and white is very useful. So, just different concepts for it. You can dig it up, security ergonomics, Rachel Elin Simpson. You'll find some good visuals and some learnings from Chrome about this.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Also, the concept of just trying to influence user behavior through design around security. You mentioned like the HTTPS thing, like changing from the green lock to the red unlock thing. Just sort of like a very subtle. We're now like changing what is the default behavior. It seems like your product kind of does that in some ways as well. Like as you're going through the test process, like actually being able to influence like future behavior based on just. Like, for example, being able to ignore a vulnerability temporarily.
Right. I think in most of these tools, we build in expertise, right? Like in Convox, you would build some expertise about all the mess that happens behind the scenes that, I don't want to understand, right? If I absolutely do not have to. Now, if I have to make a decision, it's useful for you to tell me what is the right decision here right now. If you can just make it for me, that's even better. But if you can't make it for me, then at least like point out the trade-offs and put me on the default. So we try to sort of build it towards that, through severities to tell you which ones are more important than the others. Through, in the wizard, the default option that is selected. It's the fact that you have an update and you can patch this vulnerability, but you should update. Like the default is update. If you just did enter, you'll be updating, which is the right thing in our minds. So all sorts of sort of small decisions like that.
I remember the fairly famous case of ATMs and how they used to give you your money before they give you your card back. And so people would just walk away without their cards. And now, thankfully, every ATM I've been to lately, they give you your card back before the cash comes out. And so you can't make that mistake. And those like forced behaviors and sensible defaults can go a really long way to correcting and influencing the behavior you want from people. And especially for security, that seems incredibly important.
Yeah, exactly. And there's an empathy for the user as well, right? To sort of just try to put yourself in sort of the user's shoes and understand, why is it they're doing it, right? Like they're not idiots. And when you look in security, it's just so easy. When you go to security conferences, in general, like I would say the mindset is oftentimes less than helpful. There's like, you come back from a security conference, you kind of want to curl up in a corner and cry, right? You don't, oftentimes the conferences are all about all the things that are broken and how can you break it further. While, we look at DevOps conferences, we look at those things, they're helpful, right? They're about, what can you do to sort of make it better? And they're all about the blameless pieces. So I think for security, and as is the case in many of the other components, putting yourself, having some empathy for the user, understanding, why is the user making this insecure decision, and what can you do to sort of reduce that likelihood, right, or sort of make it not happen, is very valuable.
All right. Thanks again to our guest, Guy Podjarny, for coming by. It's been awesome talking about security and UX.
Thanks a lot for having me. This was a blast.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
If people want to get in touch with you online, where can they find you?
They can look for SnykSec in Twitter or Snyk.io, and myself, I'm just Guy at Snyk.io.
All right. Thanks. That's about all we have time for today. If you're interested in being a guest on the show, or if you have a DX topic you'd like us to dive into, you can reach us at dmmc@heavybit.com or on Twitter at don'tmakemecode.
To learn more about HeavyBit, visit heavybit.com. And while you're there, check out the library. It's packed with amazing talks from founders of developer tools companies and other industry leaders.